Although Hardware 2.0 can give you a pretty good render pretty quickly, if you need some of the more complex lighting options, we're going to have to go to a more powerful render engine such as Arnold. Now, Arnold comes with Maya, but you may not see it loaded in your menu. If not, we're going to have to load the plugin again. So again, to show you how that works, we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, and the plugin we're looking for is MTOA. So it's Maya to Arnold. And so that should be loaded, and if it is, then you should see Arnold listed in almost all of the menus. Although most standard lights and materials will work in Arnold, Arnold has its own set of lights and materials that will give you a better result and will be a little bit more efficient. Arnold also has its own render view. So earlier when we were rendering, we would click this little clapboard and we would get a render in this view. And if we wanted to render again, we would have to click this render button. However, Arnold has its own render view. If we go to Arnold, open Arnold render view, we get a slightly different window. This has not rendered anything yet. This is just the render view. If we want it to start rendering, we have to hit this play button. But we already know that there's no lights in the scene. So let's go ahead and create a light. Some of the lights that are in our standard lights will work as well, but Arnold has a whole set of its own lights under the Arnold menu. So let's just go ahead and tear this off and look at a few. The first one we're going to look at is the Sky Dome light. Now when I click the Sky Dome light, you'll notice that what we get is a sphere that wraps itself all the way around our scene. This is going to be very useful later because we can use this to get more complicated lighting. But right now, all it's going to do is cast white light from all directions on our scene. Now, whenever we're ready to see a render, I'm just going to hit play on the Arnold render view. And you'll see that immediately it starts to render. Arnold's render viewer is different than Maya's render viewer because it will update every time I make a change. So if I were to change my camera location, you'll see that the Arnold render viewer tries to keep up with the changes I make. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the renders look a little bit better in Arnold Render Viewer than they were in Hardware 2.0. The ambient occlusion we were seeing earlier is much nicer in here, and just the quality of the image is looking much better. But the other thing you'll notice is that it's taking almost 5 seconds to get one frame. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop because continually rendering nonstop will start to bog down the computer after a while. I'm going to go ahead and also delete my Sky Dome. So I'm going to select the Sky Dome and hit delete. So again, we have no lights in our scene. I'm going to go ahead and create a new light in here using an area light. An area light is going to work somewhat like a directional light. As you'll see, we have a plane, and that plane has an arrow or a line pointing in the direction that light is being cast. Now, if I were to hit the play button to see our render, you'll see that we're getting a little bit of an image in here, and it's kind of hard to see. To make this a little brighter, we're going to go look at our attribute editor. Now in our attribute editor, there's a lot of options in this light. You can see that we have intensity, which will make the light brighter. We also have exposure, which will do something very similar. And so if we turn up our exposure, we'll start to see this scene coming to life a little bit more. Sometimes the scale of the scene and other issues will cause the light to not be bright enough to illuminate anything. So if we go down and uncheck normalize, this will stop taking the scale into consideration. And now you should be able to adjust your exposure to get the result you want. Now, I want you to notice that this light and the way that it illuminates this scene is very closely dependent on the scale or the size of this box shape that we're seeing here. So the smaller this shape is, the less light it will cast, but also the less area will be casting light. So if I turn my exposure and intensity way up, I can still illuminate this scene, but all of the light will be coming from a smaller object. If I scale my object up much bigger, all that light starts to wash everything out. But if I pull the intensity and the exposure back down, you'll see we're still getting a lit scene. The difference is now our shadows are going to start to seem a little softer. This is the difference in shadows cast by a very large source of light versus shadows cast by an extremely bright but small source of light, such as a spotlight or a really bright flashlight. We also have some other options inside of Arnold, including using a color temperature. This is very similar to changing the color of the light, but if I use color temperature, you'll see I can slide this slider in order to make my scene a little cooler or a little warmer. As we did earlier, we could use two different lights, one casting a warm temperature and another casting a cool temperature in order to get some contrast in our lighting. So let's do that now. I'll go ahead and move my light over here. And then Control D to duplicate that light. And then I'll move the duplicated light to the other side of the scene. And we'll change our color temperature on that to be a little cooler. And now we're getting a little bit more of an interesting lighting scenario. Something you may notice in this scene is that our shadows are looking a little bit pixelated. If I zoom in here, you'll see that there's some grain in this. This is coming from the number of samples being cast by our light. So the samples can be found in the light settings all the way at the bottom of this list here where it says samples. And if I turn that number up to something like 5 on each of our lights, I'm going to get a much higher quality render. So you can see that our shadows are already looking better, but our render time is extremely slow. We're only 70% done with our render right now. So by the time everything is done, it took 22 seconds to render this image. So this is where we can see some of the trade-off in terms of cost versus quality. If the computer you're working on right now is really fast and you feel like it's capable of handling some longer render times, then feel free to use Arnold and you can come up with some really amazing looking renders. However, maybe your computer is taking a little bit longer to render, and in that case, you can continue to use Viewport 2.0 or any of the other render solutions. The goal is just to get a nice looking image, and Arnold allows us to do that a little easier just at the cost of a longer render time.